Hello everyone, welcome to another Facebook Live. I am Andrew Lawton, True North Initiative Fellow, here on this wonderful Wednesday afternoon to chat about all the things that are happening this week. I know that we started doing these at the beginning of July, and the one thing that I'm finding is that there's been no shortage of government nannying for us to unpack in the summer months, which is kind of rare. Usually we have a little bit of a dearth in the summer. Now there's lots to talk about. And I wanted to go over a few different things here. And I put a little bit of a primer, if you will, in the blurb on Facebook. We're going to talk about Laurier University and why the school's president still doesn't understand the stakes of free speech. Going to be talking about some other things as well, little stories here and there. But a big one that I have to delve into further is the gun discussion in Canada. Now, to be clear, there should not be a gun discussion in Canada right now for a couple of reasons. Number one, you are never going to find a constructive solution to any problem when you tackle it from the heat of emotion. You just won't. You can't solve any problem. You can't have a debate of passion and expect that you're going to yield good results. The other side of it is that the Liberals already put forward a very comprehensive firearms package called C-71. Now, there were a number of things in this that I didn't like, that I thought were missing the mark, were not actually going after the real sources of gun crime. But the thing that's so important about this is that if the Liberals had more that they thought Canada needed on the firearms front, they would have put it in C-71. If the Liberals thought there was more they wanted to do with guns, they would have actually put it in the comprehensive legislation they already put forward. This is not a difficult concept to understand. So when you now have Justin Trudeau and Ralph Goodale saying that they can't rule out and won't rule out a firearms ban, a handgun ban, what they're actually saying here is that they're trying to push the gun control agenda even further because now they have the cover with which to do so. The Danforth Ave shooting was many things. An excuse to review Canada's gun laws, it wasn't. Simply put, because this guy breaks all of the molds that could actually be dealt with through legal gun ownership. Faisal Hussein, the attacker on Danforth Ave, who his family says is mentally ill, there are some questions and concerns about radical motivations. Whatever the case may be, the gun was illegal. He used an illegally obtained and illegally acquired and an illegally shot handgun, which means that none of the gun control measures that are being put forward by any of the stakeholders would actually have done anything to dissuade or stop Faisal Hussein from getting his hands on a handgun. And this is incredibly, incredibly valuable information. Because if we had a guy who, despite having mental illness concerns, having been visited by police, managed to get his hands on a legal handgun, and then took that handgun and shot some people, there would be some very serious questions to be asked that government would have to answer about how someone like that fell through the cracks, went through the system, went through all of the rules and guidelines and stipulations and all of that, and still managed to get a gun. That did not happen. He did not get his gun legally. So there is no amount of gun control that would actually have stopped the Danforth Ave shooting. And that is so heartbreaking, because we are programmed to want to prevent tragedy. We're programmed to want to find a way that we can actually avoid these things. We don't like the idea of, well, you know, bad people are going to do bad things. There is no antidote for evil in this context, and that is immensely disturbing for the population. But when you have now rhetoric pushing for a national handgun ban, a ban that would disarm me, a ban that would disarm any of you that have a handgun, that would disarm the millions of sport shooters in Canada conceivably. I think there are about a little over 1 million that have restricted licenses. So if you were to have a ban, that would take my gun away, it would take my neighbor's gun away, it would take the guns of the people down the street away. It wouldn't take the guns of the inner city gang members away. It just wouldn't. It wouldn't do it. Not it might not, or it's not perfect, or no, it fundamentally would not do it. A ban on legal handgun sales has absolutely zero bearing on the illegal gun trade. And this is something that the government officials in Canada are so deliberately obfuscating on if they don't see that and they don't think that Canadians are seeing it. So there was an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday by a University of Toronto professor, which as a general rule, I don't think that University of Toronto sociology professors should be the ones that dictate firearms policy in Canada. Just a general rule. So U of T sociology prof writes in the New York Times that it's time for Canada to review whether handguns needed to be banned altogether. And the people that support gun control cite a couple of key examples here. And I spoke about these in a video I did yesterday for True North Initiative, but Australia and the UK. And I don't view Australia and the UK as success stories on firearms policy. I just don't. And there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, in the UK, if you look at cities which still have gang problems, there is an immense challenge with knife stabbings. So much so the police have actually tried to launch knife amnesty programs and restrict the type of knives. Even Jamie Oliver, who has never met a government regulation he didn't like, was trying to say that you should have cooking knives that are not pointy at the end. They're sharp, but they're not pointy. And I actually have a couple of Jamie Oliver knives that are pointy at the end. So he can't even lead by example on his own manufacturing. But Jamie Oliver is saying, yeah, there's no need to have a pointy knife. And the reason they're saying this is because people in the UK are stabbing each other. Not to such an extent that I would call it an epidemic, but in such numbers and such increasing numbers that people are actually seeing a problem with this, that is demonstrable and that is diagnosed as such. So this is what happens if people don't have access to guns. They use something else. It doesn't make the urge for violence to go away. And someone could easily say, oh, well, you know, you're going to hurt fewer people with a knife than you will with a gun. That may be so, but it proves the point that people will find the tool that fits the motivation. And this is why rental vans have become such a problem in violence, and specifically in jihadi violence, because anyone can just go, you throw down your driver's license, you drop $50, you get your rental van, and you can actually kill more people with one of those than you can with a gun in some respects. And Australia is an even more fascinating example, because in Australia, which did a nationwide gun confiscation, they called it a buyback, but it's not a buyback. I mean, if you have no choice but to give your gun to the government, it's a confiscation. And they did this in 1997, just over 21 years ago. And what was fascinating in the case of Australia is that this came as very similar to what we're looking at in Canada, a knee-jerk reaction to something else that occurred, a knee-jerk reaction to a mass shooting that occurred in Port Arthur. And it was absolutely tragic. Australia has since been touted in some places as having had zero mass shootings, but that fundamentally isn't the case. They don't have zero mass shootings. They don't have zero gang violence. They don't have zero violent crime. And more specifically, they don't have zero gun crime. No, there was a stat that I read in The Age in Australia, theage.com.au, that looked at Melbourne specifically, which is like the gang capital of Australia. That was the sense that this article was putting forward. And they have experts saying that, you know, people are almost more armed now than they were before. When guns were legal and regulated, it was harder for criminals to get guns than it is now that guns are supposedly illegal, and the only guns in Australia are owned by gangsters. And they're getting unloaded in Australia by the shipping container with, you know, electronics and other things that are being imported. And they're getting AK-47s, Glocks, handguns, all of these types of things. And I was looking at this and was very shocked, actually, because Australia, I thought, might have a little bit more success with gun control, given that Australia is literally an island. It's an island, what, I think 9,000 miles from the United States, whereas Canada and the US share the longest unprotected border in the world. So even if Canada were to snap its fingers right now and say, guns are banned, Justin Trudeau gets his little fantasy scenario, August 1st, 2018, guns are banned in Canada. Well, that's not going to stop the flow of illegal firearms across the border. And one of the biggest challenges is that we don't actually have an accurate representation or understanding of where Canada's illegal guns are coming from. There is a stat that's been circulating that I want to debunk right now that says 50% of guns used in crime in Canada are from domestic sources. 50% are from domestic. And this is not at all true in any stretch. It's not true for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's fallacious in the way they define it. When they say guns used in crime, they don't mean just guns that are used in a robbery or a homicide. They're actually referring to guns that are at all connected to anything illegal. So a gun that might have had the serial number filed off it, which again is problematic, or a gun that, and this is my personal favorite, a gun that was improperly stored. I've seen some reports that said that might have been counted in these numbers. And the second and biggest concern is that this is not an overall stat. It was one particular study of one particular jurisdiction, and it was only 50% of the 30% of guns whose origins they could trace. 50% of the 30%. So in actuality, it could have been that 85% of the guns were sourced from the US or from overseas, but they can only identify 15% overall as being domestically sourced. But now that somehow is reported as 50%. So there is this belief that guns coming across the border illegally are not the problem, when we actually know it is. If you look back to 2005, the city of Toronto dubbed 2005 the year of the gun. And that was because there were so many firearms-related shootings, almost all of them gang-related, in Toronto. There were a couple of cases, one in particular, I think a 15-year-old girl was killed in the streets. And this was the year in 2005 that everyone said, okay, we're going to rein in gun crime in Toronto. And at that time, police were saying that guns were over 70% coming from outside the country. More than 70%. That's what they were saying at the time, in what they called the year of the gun, could be blamed on imports. And CBSA, we know for a fact, over the last few years has reported an increase in the number of illegal firearm seizures. These are only the ones that they catch. They're catching more, stands to reason that more are probably coming across. So that you can't say that there is, firstly, a simple solution to this, or a solution that exists only on one plane. Because if we are going to attack the gun issue in Canada, if we're going to attack any firearms-related issue in Canada, we have to look at where the actual illegal guns are coming from and who owns the illegal guns. And my gun has never hurt anyone. My gun will never hurt anyone as long as it's in my possession when I'm storing it legally and lawfully. And, you know, some Americans would look at Canada's gun laws and think that we were, you know, the Third Reich. It was just this totalitarian and authoritative regime. The fact that police can perform a warrantless home inspection, or that if I so much as deviate from my route when I'm driving home to the gun range and then going back home, I could conceivably be arrested and charged, could have a criminal record, tens of thousands of dollars of legal fees, and have my firearms seized. This is all within the gun laws in Canada. That my license to own a gun is a privilege from the government. American Second Amendment advocates would look at this and be like, you know, what the hell is this country? But I share that with you to share that no one can argue that we do not have one of the strictest gun control regimes in the world, which means getting a gun in Canada is easy only if you've gone through all of the steps and the processes and you've demonstrated that you're not going to be a risk to, well, anyone, to yourself or anyone. And that's why the illegal owned guns are the problem and the ones least likely to be impacted by gun control regulations. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One of the changes that Stephen Harper put in on the firearms file was removing the requirement to have a paper ATT. Now, an ATT is called an authorization to transport. And it's what you need to drive with your gun from home to the gun range or home to the gunsmith or home to a new home if you're moving. And what was fascinating about this is that if you have a license, you're eligible for an ATT. Why did the ATT need to be a separate piece of paper? It didn't. So Stephen Harper said, all right, well, we'll put the ATT as part of your license. So you aren't going to get criminally charged if you just forget to have that little piece of paper with you. Justin Trudeau and his Liberals took that, and do you remember the Eaton Center shooting a few years back? They said under Stephen Harper's model, you would be able to take your gun to the shopping center. You'd be able to take your gun to the school and shoot people up. When no such thing. He didn't change where you could take your gun. He just changed what could happen to you if you didn't have a little piece of paper that you had, that was in your possession, that you owned, that was part of your gun. And this is where the liberals get it wrong on guns. They don't know guns. The vast majority of them have probably never even held one. You've got a few examples of people in the cabinet and in the government that obviously have a history of firearms. I mean, the defense minister, Harjit Sajjan, is one of these. Andrew Leslie would be one of these. Bill Blair. I mean, these people know guns. They've been around guns. But when it comes to the actual liberal orthodoxy and the liberal policy, there is so much misinformation that circulates around these. And unfortunately, that misinformation is potentially going to become the law. And in my video yesterday, I mentioned the Australian numbers. And this is hugely important, as are the UK numbers, because these are the examples that gun control advocates love to hold up and say, this is why a ban will work. This is why we need to do a ban. They're going to look at only two extremes. They're going to say, here's gun control in the US, which is non-existent, and people are getting gunned down in the streets. And here's gun control in Australia, which is so heavy, handguns are banned, and no one's dying at all. And they don't realize that both systems are being wildly distorted. Both of them are being wildly misrepresented, and the outcomes of both of them are being distorted and twisted to fit a narrative. But they don't care about that. They don't care because they know that most people who are paying attention are not from Australia, or not from the US, or themselves don't understand how readily available guns are. And when you get John Tory, and I know I talked about this a bit last week, saying asinine things like, oh, people are just, carrying around their guns and therefore we need to ban handguns. Anyone carrying around a handgun has already shown a blatant and brazen disregard for the law. It's that simple. They've already proven that they are not going to follow the law. But the reason a handgun ban is so important is because these are the types of things that a government can do to assert itself, that a government can do to exact control over the population, but people who aren't in that group won't speak up for that group. There is very little sympathy for handgun owners. There's very little sympathy for sport shooters. And by the way, I'm not saying there needs to be sympathy. I'm not saying people need to be sympathetic to sport shooters. I'm saying that you need to say in your own mind, if you're not a fan, just don't do it. If you don't like the idea of handguns, don't get one. Don't go out shooting. But don't take away my right because of your discomfort, especially when I'm not the problem. And that is going to be the hill that a lot of people are going to have to die on, because if Justin Trudeau's government does in fact go forward with a handgun ban or seriously looks into it, or perhaps a moratorium, no new handgun purchases. That way, anyone who has one now is going to do it. By the way, handgun shares in Canada will go up so dramatically the second that policy is announced, because everyone, myself included, going to rush to the gun store and buy whatever they can, and if we get a whiff of that. Now, conceivably, the Justice Minister, the Public Safety Minister, could, with the stroke of the pen, ban handguns right now, classify them all as prohibited. And there would be no legislative oversight, there would be no committee hearing, there would be nothing whatsoever. This is within their purview. I just want you to imagine that. The government of Canada saying one day, we've decided that all of these things that you legally own, that you paid money for, are not allowed. It's like Catherine McKenna's dream scenario. You do that with every non-hybrid car one day. You wake up and say, any diesel or gas engine, no, we're going to ban it. I mean, this is the stuff she dreams about at night. This is what Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale could do about firearms. And I'm not saying they'd go down that road, because there would, in fact, be a political revolt. But that is, in fact, a possibility. And you've got advocates that are proposing very fervently to have a unequivocal handgun ban. And one of the examples of this is Natalie Provost. She is with one of the pro-gun control groups. She is a survivor of the massacre at L'École Polytechnique. And my heart goes out to this woman who went through an absolute horror. She saw her friends and classmates get gunned down. But being the victim or survivor of a tragedy does not make you an expert on anything. And she is the grown-up example of the kids from Parkland, Florida, from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High. And they are, in 30 years, going to be what Natalie Provost is now, which is someone who says, you know, I think we should ban guns because of what an evil person did with a gun to me 30 years ago. And it's not to say that she shouldn't be listened to. People should listen to her in the same way that they should listen to the gun owners that speak up. It's that she was actually given special privilege and put on the Firearms Advisory Committee, and basically no one on that committee represented a group of gun owners. And I wrote about this for Global News a few months back. There was no representation on that committee of any of the major gun groups in Canada. And I'm a member of two of those groups, by the way. But because the government didn't actually care about listening to the people who know and understand guns, the people who are actually sport shooters. So to go back to that point that I started on a moment ago, the reason that it's so important to pay attention to a handgun ban is because these types of things test what a government is willing to do because it thinks it has the political cover to do it. So if the federal government is not seeing a huge backlash on the idea of a handgun ban, or the federal government is able to say, you know what, we're entertaining a handgun ban, and the only people that get mad at them are handgun owners, who, let's face it, probably weren't liberal voters in the first place, then government can move the boundaries and move the goalposts further and further until lawful ownership of something is subjected relentlessly to the whim of whatever government is in office there. You don't need to like guns. You don't need to appreciate them. You don't need to want one. You don't need to buy one. You just have to accept that the people that have gone through all of those steps that the government has laid out are not the problems. They're not the source of gun crime. So this issue is going to get worse before it gets better. We're in the summer right now. Parliament is not sitting. They will be coming back soon. But if they really want to strike while the iron is hot, strike while the crisis is still very much alive, then what they're going to actually find here, and this is going to be fascinating, is that emotion will be the only way legislation is determined. Emotion is going to be the way the legislation is put forward. The government looks and says, here is a crisis. Here is this thing that's remotely connected to the crisis. It wouldn't really have done anything anyway, but you know, they both involve things that go pow pow. Therefore, we're going to ban them. It doesn't get more intellectually deep than that right now. Oh, some guy used a gun. All right, well, ban handguns. But he used a handgun, right? Yeah, but it wasn't legal. It doesn't matter. We'll ban them anyway. And then when the next shooting happens, and there will be another shooting, because this is life, this is human nature. When the next shooting happens, people like me will say, I told you so. People like them will be like, all right, we didn't go far enough. And before you know it, the entire country's guns have been taken away with no benefit whatsoever. The only thing we see on the other side of it, the only outcome, is more control for the government. This is the direction we're headed. They're going to keep moving the envelope because C-71, the firearms bill that already went forward, was, again, nowhere near a handgun ban. It had issues, sure, but it wasn't talking about a handgun ban. But then a shooting happens and we see the discussion moving further. And when another one happens, it will keep going down the line, which is why we have to stop now. You know, I did an interview with Barbara Kay, which you can catch on the True North Initiative Facebook page or on YouTube. And in that interview, one of the things that came up when it comes to free speech is that the little things are never the little things. And I know it's been adapted and distorted and used in like every context under the sun. That famous poem from Martin Niemöller. First they came for the trade unionists, the communists, the Jews, the blah, 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 blah. And you can adapt that to so many environments because the idea that Pastor Niemöller was putting forward was that you have to speak up when groups other than your own are under the microscope. And I'm not at all comparing what happened in the generation in which that was written to what's happening on gun owners. But I am invoking this idea that non-gun owners need to speak up and say, all right, even if I'm not a gun owner, I think this is dirty the way this is unfolding. And I don't think that is at all unreasonable here. And with that, I actually wanted to move to this discussion by Deborah McClatchy, that was started. Now, Deborah McClatchy, she was the president and vice chancellor, is actually, at Wilfrid Laurier University, which it seems like a lot longer ago. It was less than a year ago that Wilfrid Laurier University was injected in this cultural battle about free speech on college and university campuses. And Deborah McClatchy was the woman who initially was not stepping up to defend Lindsay Shepherd. She said, all right, well, we'll have a review. And then at the end of the review, she said, yes, you know, this shouldn't have happened. But it's been a very lukewarm approach to free speech she's taken. She wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail called "Not Merely Free Speech, but Better Speech Needs to be Protected on Campus." Now, this is a when I saw the headline, I'm like, oh man, I know exactly what I'm about to read. And to be fair, she had a couple of good points. She had a couple of points that I thought were valid here. I pulled it up so I don't misquote it. She says, I can see that universities, this is not one of the points that I agree with. She says, I can see that universities have a greater responsibility than merely protecting free speech. We must also promote better speech in an increasingly polarized and complex world. Universities exist to create, preserve, apply, and pass on knowledge. We have a responsibility to ensure our students recognize the importance of free speech in the pursuit of knowledge. Speech is the path to learning what others think and believe so that we can learn from each other. Universities are also beacons of opportunity and serve as springboards for intellectual, social, and economic mobility. Our institutions must respect the dignity of those who come to our campuses to study, research, and teach. To do so, we strive to create campus environments that support human rights for everyone. So she starts off there with a good point, which is that speech is the way you learn and think and grow and debate. But when she talks about social and economic mobility and how universities need to serve as springboards for this, she gets perilously close to where I feared she was going. She writes this, which is good. There are times when students will undoubtedly encounter views they find challenging and possibly offensive. It is not the role of a university to shelter students from intellectual discomfort or to censor speech that falls within the limits of Canada's laws on discrimination, harassment, and hate speech. Doing so would set a dangerous precedent and be antithetical to the spirit of open inquiry. In the face of language that threatens the humanity of our students, staff, or faculty, we must continually promote better speech. This means questioning and challenging opinions with sound arguments and evidence. Students and faculty must be able to share views and experience while simultaneously committing to high ethical and intellectual standards for open, constructive conversations. Now, I believe that she's trying to walk a tightrope here. I believe that she's trying to write something that makes it sound like she's not one of those, you know, darn free speech absolutists like myself, because those people are all Nazis and fascists and bigots and whatever. She's not saying this, but a lot of the people on her campus are saying this. So she's saying that, okay, yeah, free speech is fine, but we need to strive to have better speech. The problem comes when university administrators and educrats try to be the arbiters of what is intellectually honest and what those high standards are. Because if you looked at the people that were in that inquisition on Lindsay Shepherd, the two professors in the school's sexual violence expert or whatever, if you look at those three people, they all thought that they were committing to high ethical and intellectual standards, because there's no way playing a clip of a Jordan Peterson segment is actually a high intellectual or ethical standard. That's the whole point. So Deborah McClatchy is speaking a language that the censors on campus would agree with, because they think that they're the ones that get to set those standards. McClatchy continues, this requires critical reflection. Are our arguments based on evidence? Have we listened to the knowledge and experience of others? Have we tested our assumptions? How can we continue to learn and pursue the truth? This is how universities foster an environment for intellectual growth and the development of new knowledge. So what she's saying there is that it's what free speech advocates have been pushing for. Yeah, you have to debate and discuss and analyze and all of this stuff, but you can only do that when you start by allowing discussions. But her concern is that Over the past few years, inflammatory debate and rhetoric have taken center stage. She says speech that denigrates the dignity and humanity of members of society is challenged because our communities fully engage in free expression. So she's arguing that that challenging and trying to shut someone down is an engagement of free expression. That's what she's tacitly endorsing, because that's been what happened at Berkeley. That was what happened at Laurier. People with power, to use their language, people with privilege, shouted down those that had a markedly conservative viewpoint. That does not mean they have a commitment to freedom of expression, like what McClatchy is saying here. So the fascinating thing is that this article, which in many respects is saying a whole lot of nothing, but in doing so says something big, completely misses the mark on where the campus free speech discussion really is now. And that is that no one gets to decide what their truth is. No one gets to decide what truth is relative to their truth also. So when you look at these debates that are happening on campus about whether certain groups should be allowed to assemble, it's not the role nor the right of universities to determine which of these ideas are worthy of debate and discussion. And it was fascinating because I can't remember if I mentioned this in a previous show. If I did, bear with me. During the election in which I was a candidate in Ontario, I had comments that I made, I think like a year earlier, thrown back at me about me saying that Holocaust deniers on campus shouldn't be shut down. I said, yeah, if there's someone who's a Holocaust denier, I think they're a deplorable, reprehensible person, but let them have their little debate. Let them have their little gang meeting of anti-Semites. And that got torqued into Andrew Lawton is a Holocaust denier, because apparently under today's standards, if you support the right for a specific person, you then support that person, and then eventually it's a hop, skip, and a jump to you are that person. And this is one of the biggest failings of the campus ethos now, this idea that allowing something means endorsing it. No, allowing it just means that you are endorsing that higher order belief that freedom of speech is an important value and an important concept. And at universities, again, I'll use this cliche, especially at universities, that should be a goal. But it was funny because McClatchy is trying to walk this tightrope here, and she's trying to say, well, you know, it's free speech is fine, but there's always the but. And when you start qualifying free speech, you're actually not believing in free speech. And then you compare that with there was actually he was the dean of the university, I think 2 or 3 years ago. Everett Piper was his name, and I interviewed him once. He was the head of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, if memory serves. And he wrote a famous blog post that says this is a university, not a daycare. And he ended up expanding that into a book called Not a Daycare. And he was saying, look, if you're in university because you think that, you know, your worldview is the one that should be protected and coddled, bubble wrapped, I'm sorry, I don't want you going here. And he said that after that post of his went viral, he actually had enrollment spike at his school, because there was enough of a yearning from students and prospective students to break out of that bubble that allowed the Lindsay Shepherd phenomenon to exist in the first place, and that bubble that's allowed Jordan Peterson's rise to be as meteoric as it has, and that bubble that we start seeing now. I mean, they call it the intellectual dark web. It's this belief system that, you know, the Dave Rubins and the Sam Harrises and the Lindsay Shepherds and the Mark Steins and maybe the Andrew Lawtons, who know, that all of us are on this sort of this subcutaneous level in the world right now. And it's fascinating that that's the way it's needed to be. And when I look at the McClatchy article, and I want to quote one final paragraph here, she writes, through practicing and emphasizing better speech, we can confront controversial views with intellectually rigorous and constructive dialogue. Sometimes the ideal of debate cannot happen in real time. Organizing alternative programming, inviting speakers to express opposing views, and/or engaging in nonviolent protests are strategies that contribute to a campus that values inclusive freedom. What does inclusive freedom mean? If freedom is a right for all, it doesn't need to be qualified as inclusive. If freedom is a right, if freedom is freedom, of course it is for all. No, when you start hearing that qualification, inclusive freedom, they're saying freedom, but freedom with a but. Freedom with a but, freedom with an if, freedom with a maybe. That isn't freedom. That certainly isn't free speech. And to be fair, I'm not against inclusion. I'm not against all of these things that she describes. If you want to have a nonviolent protest, go. If you want to have an alternate speaker, go. But there was something very sneaky in that. And it was buried at the bottom of the story, that the ideal of debate can sometimes not happen in real time. So what she's referring to there is that if, you know, such and such a speaker believes this and such a professor believes this, and I want to put them on the stage at the same time, she's saying, yeah, sometimes that doesn't happen. Maybe you could just have them separately, or have a protest for the one speaker, as though, you know, X speaking and Y protesting is somehow a better way to contrast ideas than the two of them on the stage at the same time. You know, there's an entirely new glossary that's emerging when it comes to these issues. And in that glossary, we have terms like problematic. Lindsay Shepherd showing the Jordan Peterson clip was problematic. Or debating someone with an objectionable viewpoint. You can't do that because then you're normalizing them. Or if I say something to you that you don't like and I meant it entirely nicely and you took it in a different way, that's a microaggression. But these words are very much becoming anything but fringe terms. These words are actually becoming concepts that have a very significant force on campuses. And this does not move us closer to inclusive freedom. No, it moves us closer to what it is that this whole free speech exercise at Laurier was supposed to be a response to, which is a grad student and TA getting hauled before a kangaroo court because she dared to normalize Jordan Peterson, because she dared to actually show a clip of a debate. Debate itself was the problem because debate is based on equal footing. And you can actually look at this. There was a book that I read, and I interviewed the author, and I can't remember his name, and I'm very grateful for that because I've kind of blocked him from my memory, but the book was called Antifa. And it was a book by an Antifa professor from, if memory serves, Dartmouth College in the US. And what he was saying was that, you know, Antifa is not a group, it's a separate series of groups and all of that. And he was actually talking about no platforming. And he said, well, it's reasonable if you're combating fascism. And he said, even violence can be a tool to defeat fascism. And when you ask him for his definition of fascism, it's basically anyone and everyone under the sun. Oh, Ann Coulter's a fascist. Oh, you know, this person's a fascist. And basically by the end of it, I think he's the only one left who's not a fascist. And this is the problem with the definitions, is that they will play these verbal gymnastics to justify what are fundamentally anti-freedom tactics. Or, for example, you talk about free speech and you say to an Antifa member at a campus, well, you know, just so you know, when you're trying to silence this person that's opposing their free speech, and they say, well, this is my personal favorite, free speech is an oppressive concept, or free speech is a concept that is skewed towards those with privilege. So they don't even exist on that same plane that normal human beings exist on. And when you look at what's happening, not just at Laurier, but at other schools, I had the chance a couple of weeks back to speak at the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry. And this is the group that was actually founded by Lindsay Shepherd at Laurier. And I was speaking about a number of terms. And one of them that came up was this idea of, I was talking, it had nothing to do with Laurier, but it was a guy out east who had watched an Amnesty presentation. Amnesty had hosted this presentation where a U of T prof was speaking about female genital mutilation. And at the end of this, this guy got up, and he was an African immigrant, and he got up and he said, well, you know, I'm not talking about the process, but I'm concerned that some of the language that we use is oppressive or colonial. That we frame the discussions of female genital mutilation through a colonial lens, and I'm concerned about that. So he just witnesses this presentation about you know, little girls who are having these irreparable things done to their bodies, and he's like, we're kind of framing this in a colonial way. And that was such it was such a terrible moment, because this is an idea that would only exist on university campuses. And I mentioned in my remarks, I said, you know, I couldn't believe that we were actually debating female genital, or that they at this event were actually debating the merits of female genital mutilation. And the professor said as much. He's like, I didn't come here to, like, I didn't think we were going to be debating. I thought everyone would accept that it was bad. And there was a legitimate challenge. Someone, I didn't learn about it until after the fact, but someone had said to the person they were sitting behind, well, hang on, isn't this hypocritical for Andrew to say this, because he was just saying that, you know, we should be able to debate everything. And that's a fair point. But to be clear, I wasn't saying that you shouldn't be allowed to have that debate. But I was going to say that only on university campuses would that debate be a justifiable one. Only on a university campus would someone think, you know, the merits of female genital mutilation are in some way up for debate, up for discussion. And my goodness, this is something that we're going to see a lot more of. And a group of professors at Laurier actually banded together and tried to get the school to put a statement of principles forward. They were inspired by the Chicago principles, an unequivocal commitment to free speech, something that is so important, not just for a campus, any environment. Any environment needs one, any workplace, any academic institution, any political party, heck, even a group of friends. A group of friends should have a tacit understanding that we can speak our minds and do whatever we want, because it's all in the spirit of something bigger than us as individuals. But that doesn't happen now. That doesn't happen at all. And really what we are seeing at campuses is the opposite of that, where to mention the term free speech is to invoke this antiquated and oppressive notion that doesn't jibe with whatever the cause of the day is on campus. So again, female genital mutilation, something that everyone should be able to rally behind as being a negative, is now held up as something that has to be avoided to be framed through a colonial lens, because you can't sound oppressive or Western-minded when you're talking about something that people are doing in the third world and in the developing world. And I find that to be a really dangerous trend, and one that we do need to stop. And someone reached out to me yesterday, or it might have been 2 days ago, a woman, a very heartfelt message. She's like, well, how do we fight this? And for starters, you've got to actually speak up against it in the moment. And that age-old quote from Jordan Peterson, he said, you get punished for speaking up, you get punished for not speaking up, you don't get to choose no punishment at all. He said, the best you get to do is pick your punishment. And that's really stuck with me. Because if we accept that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and you're going to be screwed no matter what, the question is, okay, do you want to be screwed for doing something or screwed for not doing something? And that, in all honesty, is a very myopic way of viewing things. It's horrifying that that's actually where it has to be, but that is where we are right now. And to confront controversial ideas on campus, in the media, in politics, to confront controversial ideas can't be done without free speech. The same free speech that allows for those controversial ideas to be expressed in the first place. And that's what we need to see happening. Now, I wanted to get to one other topic here, to move away from the decline of Western civilization and onto the carbon tax. I saw a little flurry of excitement earlier about the idea that Justin Trudeau is trying to walk back in some way carbon tax in Canada. And I want to tell people to not actually get excited. There is very little good about what we're seeing Justin Trudeau's government put forward now. The headline, Liberals plan to soften carbon tax plan. What it actually means, and actually I want to read the CTV one, because the CTV one I thought was really giving the wrong impression here. Do I still have it? Oh yes, breaking news, federal government easing proposed carbon tax. And I heard this and I was like, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? Are we walking it back? Because there was actually an op-ed in the National Post written by Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, saying that the federal government, quote, would be well advised to consider the withdrawal of their one-size-fits-all tax and adopt a more collegial approach to addressing climate change. And Premier Moe was talking about why Canadians generally support Saskatchewan's fight against the Trudeau carbon tax, which is now Doug Ford's fight, which is now PEI's fight, which is now, I forget the other, was another province there. Manitoba is fighting on dollar value, not on the existence of a tax. But here is the actual change. So the Liberal government is actually just changing the specific price. They're going to raise the cutoff point for carbon taxes. And this will have the biggest impact on companies that are operating with a little bit more efficiency than the industry average. So they're trying to say that companies that are doing a better job should be penalized a bit less. The worst polluters whose emissions exceed their average will see their liability shrink, but they're not actually going to, it's not going to be an elimination of the carbon tax. And I'm trying to get the number here because back in January, Catherine McKenna said the benchmark was 70% of an industry's average emissions. So if your industry's average emissions performance was at a certain level, you would get taxed on anything over 70% of that. So even average was somehow being penalized. Even below average was being penalized. Now they've adjusted it to 80%. And for some industries, 90%. So if you are at any more than 80% of your industry's average emissions, then you're still going to be subject to the tax. So we haven't actually seen a change here that is all that substantive. They're fiddling around with the numbers, but it doesn't change the actual flaw, which is that the federal government is trying to impose a carbon tax on provinces that don't want one, on provinces that don't need one, and on companies that can't afford one. And there was a survey that was actually done. 2 out of 3 Canadians say provinces should have the final say on carbon tax. And I find this to be really fascinating. So right now there's a push. Now Toronto had a column that was arguing that the federal government should get in and crack skulls and start taking away provincial rights when it comes to municipalities. So you had Doug Ford shrinking the size of Toronto City Council. You had no one really outraged by that. The only people outraged were Toronto City Councillors, which generally speaking suggests that he was probably onto something. But it was actually quite amusing because I saw this issue unfold where people were saying that, okay, the federal government needs to respect, you know, certain rules and regulations, and the federal government needs to respect lower levels of government. And when it comes to carbon tax, the federal government's like, nope, we're doing it. This is our choice. Whereas you could argue that the climate is a national issue, not a provincial issue. But I'd say, well, it's an international issue by that standard. The climate is not limited to Canada's borders. It's international. So why shouldn't provinces get to deal with the economic impact of any policy that is going to be targeted towards environmental initiatives? And that's why when Jason Kenney wins Alberta, which I'm pretty sure he's going to, when Jason Kenney wins the Alberta election, we will have the vast majority of the country's governments and the vast majority of the population's representatives in government saying to the federal authorities, nope, this is not happening. And I honestly hope that the next election is in fact a catalyst for us having the debate about carbon tax, having the debate about it, and basically making Justin Trudeau go to the people and say, I want to get another term so I can impose a tax on your provincial governments and a tax on you. And if he can say that with a straight face and win re-election in 2019, he deserves it. But I don't think Canadians will reward that. But I just wanted to make very clear that you understand that this easing that the federal government's doing is pretty much inconsequential. It's very, very lackluster for those of us, including myself, including Scott Moe, including Doug Ford, that are saying, no, the problem is not the specific number, the specific formula. The problem is this idea of a federally imposed carbon tax in the first place. That does it for me for today. I want to say thank you very much for tuning in. If you'd like to reach out, my email address is andrew@andrewlawton.ca. And if you have any suggestions, by the way, this is something we'll kind of do and have a little bit of fun with. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see me cover, send me a note or send me a Facebook message. There, I pointed the right direction this time. My Facebook link is up there. And just a little bit of a public service announcement before we go. If you are in Alberta, be very careful. A pregnant mom was served a glass of cleaning solution instead of a latte at her neighborhood McDonald's. And I won't say what city it was in. Actually, maybe I will. No, I won't say what city it was in. But it rhymes with Schmethbridge. And she was served a cleaning agent, and McDonald's has apologized, and they've said they forgot to disconnect the cleaning lines from the latte machines. So, you know, say what you will about Starbucks, but I've never been served a cleaning solution at Starbucks, like apparently there. I want to see what she's getting in return. That's what I wanted to know. Like if she'll get like a $10 gift card or something. I don't know. They've apologized profusely. Accidents do happen. But I saw that story going around. This is the problem. So every now and then when you talk about minimum wage hikes, there's always the debate about, okay, well, companies are more likely to now just replace cashiers and employees with machines. This is why you can't really trust machines all that much. There's a human element. I mean, I may have had bad service at a restaurant before, but they've never poured a Javex into my cup and given it to me. That's a mistake that only a machine would make. For the True North Initiative, I'm Andrew Lawton. Hope you all have a great rest of the week and a great weekend. Thank you. God bless and good day.